Hey everyone, it's Landa. Today we're going to paint a black-eyed Susan. We're using watercolors and just 3 colors. We're using raw sienna, burnt umber, and I think I remember it's Hooker's green. So grab your paints, get some water, something to dab your paintbrush on, and let's get started. So the first thing that I'm going to do, because this is similar to one of my watercolor painting kits, I'm going to take a drop of water and just add that to each one of my colors. This starts to activate your paints. And it's the same thing that you would do with your set of paints at home. So I'm going to do that to get it started. I'm also going to tape down my small outline. Now I create all these outlines on watercolor paper. This is heavy 140-pound watercolor paper. You could just draw this in your sketchbook at home. Now, just like anything that you do in watercolor, the first thing that we're going to do is think in terms of light to dark. So taking a look at our black-eyed Susan here, the main part of the black-eyed Susan is the flower itself, all the nice bright petals, and then we have this kind of center point and then the stem. So my 3 colors are a little bit more muted. I like to keep a really just small color palette when I'm doing these things for my classes for homework. And so that's why I chose these, but you could also include yellow. So if you wanted to, I would recommend cadmium yellow. It's a nice warm yellow. You can use that to kind of brighten this up. But today I'm going to be using just my limited color palette. And what we're going to use is this burnt umber to create a shadow. So like I said before, we're going to start out with our lighter color and we're going to build up as we go. So I'm going to do this petal by petal. And then once you kind of get the gist, you can kind of go ahead and repeat the process. So typically with any of these flowers, you're going to see the darkest shadow at near the center and also at the edge of the petal. So what you can do, I'm going to show you a few different ways you can do this. You can start by painting directly with that raw sienna at the top and at the bottom of that petal. Wash your brush out, have a clean damp brush, start in the middle and just kind of wiggle your brush around, and then touch the edge of that so it blends and bleeds. Now if you're feeling bold, you could start with a little bit more concentrated paint and then dab that in there too. But you can do that right at the start and also as you go. So just like anything, you want to make sure that like you don't paint right next to that last petal. So I'm gonna, if the next petal doesn't touch, then I'm gonna keep going. So let's see that process one more time. While that's kind of setting, I'm not gonna let it dry completely, but I'm gonna let it dry a little bit more. I'm gonna do the same process on the next petal. So I'm painting directly, washing my brush out, dabbing it off, and then I'm gonna start in the middle, just painting water, and I'm gonna wiggle my brush so that it bleeds, and just a little bit. And I can always push back if the paint pulls too much towards that middle of that petal, okay? And now that this other petal is a little bit drier, I'm gonna add more paint to it because it's just not dark enough for me. Add just a tiny bit of paint in those darker areas. And what this is doing, so hopefully you can see this at home, is that it's leaving a highlight in the middle of each one of those petals. It makes it look bent, like it's curved back into the center of the flower. So that's what we're aiming for. Now, if you need it to be a little bit darker, grab some of your burnt umber, or if you have cadmium orange at home, I would use a little bit of cadmium orange too, to mix in with my raw sienna or my yellow to make a deeper color, your shadowed color. And I'm still going to do this while it's semi-wet. Just want it to be damp so that it blends. I'm going to move this. There we go. Nice. So keep repeating this process for each one of those petals. You can see I'm just dabbing off a little water and blending that out. I keep repeating this process. Some of these teeny tiny petals way in the back, you don't really need to add that. You don't have to blend it out. So I might even just leave a spot white and not even bother trying to blend it out because it's so small. So when you're working in a small space, you know, sometimes it's too challenging to create these itty bitty shadows or gradients. I hope you're noticing every single petal I'm approaching exactly in the same way. So as it gets closer towards the center of the flower, it gets darker. As it gets closer to the edge of the petal, it gets darker as well. And then it stays really nice and light in the center, and that's what's making it look like it's bending. And these bigger petals, I will blend out so that it has a nice softer gradient. Now you're noticing probably there's one area of my paint that had a little bit too much gum arabic. It's one of the binders in your watercolor paint. One of the ingredients in your watercolor paint sometimes makes it really sticky. And I found painting with raw sienna, that paint, for whatever reason, and I use Winsor Newton paint, it tends to not mix very well in the tube. So occasionally I'll have to squeeze out a lot and get out some of that extra binder or extra gum arabic. It's just too much. And then it doesn't flow properly. So if you notice that, then, you know, sometimes what you can do is you can mix it all together on your palette. When I'm painting like this with a kit, I just avoid that area, and then it's not as sticky. And some of these that you already painted, you can go back over with a thin layer. That's the glazing process. And if it gets too dark, since I've already re-wet it, I can lift that out. But that's gonna just intensify some of that nice yellowy color right there. I'm gonna just paint that one entirely. Push this back. And remember to add some, oh, that's a lot of burnt umber. That's okay. I'm gonna just blend that out. So if that happens to you, just push it back. You'll hear me say that a lot in these videos. So, you know, you can control the flow of your paint and water with your brush. So just push it back where it needs to be, and then it's good. Sometimes I actually really like intensifying the shadowy areas and creating a higher contrast than maybe is realistic. And that's just me. I just tend to really like sharp contrasts. So, you know, this is your flower. You can do whatever you like. Like I said before, you want it more yellow, use some cadmium yellow or a little bit of orange. And I'm just going to keep intensifying some of these shadows. We're almost ready to do the center of our flower. And you can always play around with this if it gets too dark too quickly. I'm just kind of having fun here. And then as it gets to this kind of middle stage of wetness, this is as it gets a little bit drier, you can start to add some details like these lines or dents in the middle of the flower to kind of give it some more definition, make it look more realistic. Look how pretty that is. Okay, so now what we're gonna do, obviously the edge that I just completed around the center of the flower is still wet. So I'm gonna give it a second to dry. And while I'm letting it dry, I'm gonna quickly do the stem, which is just a little bit of this hooker's green. And I'm gonna mix it in with either my brown or my raw sienna, and that's gonna make it look nice and warm. So look at how quickly that changed that hooker's green to almost a sap green that's a little bit more muted. And that's gonna make it look more realistic. So we could even, just to show you how close that is now. So I'm gonna add that to the stem. I'm gonna paint a really light layer directly. I'm gonna let it dry, and I'm gonna also paint that leaf. And just like your petals, you wanna think in the same way. So the edge of the leaf should be a little bit darker than the rest of it. And then the same thing with the area that touches the stem. So I'm just gonna add a little bit here and there, and it's gonna make it look bent. There we go. And you can, another trick too, you can see I'm making this leaf bigger. So if I make a mistake, things just get larger. And that's totally fine with me. All right. And then the second thing we can do, that stem is going to dry very quickly because it's a super small area. I'm going to make a slightly darker brown, or not brown, but darker green by adding a little bit of burnt umber to my hooker's green. And I'm going to just, I think I'm going to choose the right hand side as my shadowed side. Looks like the flower is kind of tilted up facing the sun, or at least that's what I like to think. And I'm going to add a shadow and maybe use a little extra to add some details on the leaf. Okay. Nice. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do the same thing that we did with our petals. We're going to start with a light layer in the center of the flower and, with our brown. This is just brown. Because you can always change it, make it darker, but once you start with a dark color, you can only make it darker. So it's best to kind of start light, even with a dark color. And I'm gonna paint right on top of some of those areas that I already painted for the shadow, because it's just gonna intensify that shadow when it gets layered up. I'm gonna let that dry, and while that first layer is drying, I'm gonna make a color as close to black as I possibly can. Now at home, I think using Payne's gray would be really nice, but since I'm using a limited color palette, I'm going to take some of that green and mostly burnt umber, and I'm going to mix it. You can see I'm going to dab off a little extra. Look at how dark that gets. A little bit more. And that is very dark. Look at how dark that is. Very, very dark brown. So that's just hooker's green and burnt umber. My area is almost dry. Now I'm going to wait a tiny bit longer because I really don't want to mess this up, because otherwise you won't be able to see this nice light area in the middle. But what we're going to go for here, now if you look at the center of these, it's kind of inspired by that. So the edge, this is kind of a cylinder or a half circle in the middle of your flower. So a cylinder, to make it look realistic, it's going to have shadows on one side and the other side and a highlight in the middle. Since we decided that we're going to have the shadowed side on the right hand side of our flower, we're going to have more of a shadow on the right hand side of that middle bit, okay? And the same thing with this kind of dome shape in the center of that as well. And that'll make more sense in just a second. So let's go ahead and do that. So a little bit on the, I'm going to paint with that color I mixed up. It's a little green, but that's okay. I'm going to add a little bit more brown. A little bit on the left, a little bit on the right. That's really kind of intense. And I'm going to add a little bit of detail just on the top. I'll wash my brush out, or just get rid of some of it actually, because I don't want a lot of water. This is very concentrated right now. I don't want it to get watery because then I won't be able to control it. But I still do want a little less. There we go. And now with a damp, clean brush, I'm gonna just wiggle that edge out just to barely fan it out. Remember, I want more of a shadow on that right-hand side. Dab off the extra. Now, I pulled it down from the top a little to the left on this part, but on this side, I'm actually going to push it back, because remember, I want that shadowy side, but I don't want to accidentally drag the paint too far. So I'm actually pushing it back to the place where I started. Now already this is looking pretty realistic. You can see the color that we first layered kind of shining through. And now we're going to make this dome. So you can use a little bit more of the brown in this layer if you want, or stick to that color that you created. Mine is just a touch green, so I'm going to add a little bit more burnt umber to it. It can also be a tiny bit lighter too. And I'm going to add it just to the right-hand side, almost like a backward C. And a little tiny C or L shape on the left, because remember the right-hand side is our shadowed side. Washing my brush out, dabbing it off. And then I'm going to push the color back to that right-hand side. And then same thing on the left. That's pretty cool. And that's basically done. If you want to intensify anything, you can. I mean, I can fiddle with stuff for days, but that looks pretty nice. I like the way that looks. So, just like I said, I could probably fiddle for days. Now, you could leave this as is, or I thought it might be really fun to do kind of like a soft wet and wet around the background. But since these are really light, you just want to be careful so that you don't, your first layer of water, if you're doing wet to wet, just make sure that you stop short of the actual object itself. And if you want to see what that might look like, I'm just doing a little bit of water painting around it, and you can see there's almost like a halo of dry paper around it. And the trick is that once you start adding and dropping in color, then that's when you can push towards the actual object itself. But it's best to just avoid that for now. And I might drop in a little bit. I have got some dried pink gouache over here, and I might drop that in because I'm really loving this pop of pink. If you can see that right here. And again, I started out with a limited palette because that's what I gave my students for their homework. But you can add as many other, you can add more colors. But the other thing too, you can tell from this picture, a limited palette is always going to unify your colors. It's going to kind of create harmony, color harmony. So look, these three colors made this whole entire flower, which is very pretty. And it looks a little bit, it's not realistic, super realistic, but probably more than if you just used bright yellow. Okay, so I've just wet the entire surface. Now I'm gonna get some really watery green, mix in. I don't want it that bright, that's kind of crazy. Mix in a little bit of my raw sienna. And then I'm gonna just paint around my flower. And this is now, once you remember, now that I can see the paint that I'm dropping in, then you can get right next to the flower itself. And this is when you can get playful. I'm gonna paint, drop in other colors into the paint and let it mix on the surface. Make sure that those edges of where you just dropped in paint, I always kind of babysit them so that it stays wet. Otherwise, you're going to get hard lines where you don't want them. So you just have to keep an eye on them. And now that my paintbrush is dirty, I can really see all of it, which is good. And you could start out that way too. Let's do a little bit more of this green. Look how pretty this is. Or you could, if you wanted, paint more of these, but I thought this would be a really fun for your 100-day challenge, because it's just a single flower. Sometimes it can get so overwhelming to decide what you want to paint for something like that, and it's nice to have somebody else just choose for you. Oh yeah, I wanted to add a little bit. I told you I was going to do the pink, so let's do a little bit of that pink. Remember, I'm continuously making sure that my surface is wet so that when I drop those colors in, it's not gonna look like a line, and it's gonna look softer, just like this picture, this reference image here. But not too wet. So I call this like a satin level of wetness. All right, that's pretty. And now I'll do a little bit of this fuchsia. This is gouache, so it's going to behave slightly differently. It's gouache is opaque, but it also is water base. That's kind of neat. I don't know. Maybe not. I think we gotta have more color here. There. And then of course we want it to look realistic on this side. We don't want to this shadowy bit to just stop. There we go. Nice. So I could have probably, like, if I spent more time on this, I would intensify some of these background colors to make some of the edge of my flower pop. I think this is starting to do a little bit of that. So if this was something I wanted to finish a bit more, that's what I would do. I'd intensify some of those background colors and also intensify some of the edges of these areas of the flower where it just kind of disappears. But that is a stylistic choice, so it's all up to you. I hope you had a ton of fun with this. Stick around for more of these fun little tutorials, and if you're interested in an art kit, you want to paint along at home, go ahead and head to my website and grab a watercolor kit. Hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.